All right, we are in the final two chapters of Revelation, bringing about a conclusion to the entire book, and we all said, yay.
I've enjoyed this.
You've enjoyed it. Good. What's that? These are the best two chapters. All right. The first section wraps up the fifth major section of the book that began in chapter 17. I talked about that last week a little bit. So we're going to see a lot of similarities between the opening of chapter 17 and the opening of chapter 21. Here we have Babylon being the focus, and now we're going to get the city, Jerusalem, as a focus. And so we're going to see a lot of similarities between the two, which is interesting how John does that. So chapter 17 dealt with the city of Babylon being judged for her adulteries. These are followed by the beast being judged in chapter 19 and the dragon in chapter 20. So the small section at the beginning of chapter 21 stems from 20 verse 11 with the earth and heavens fleeing from God's presence. It also provides a contrast with the heavenly city appearing, which we'll talk about in greater detail in the next section. So, someone wants to read Revelation 21, 1 through 8. We can get started.
I'll get it.
All right, sweet, Rebecca.
That was nice. He called you sweet.
I don't think that's what he meant. I hope not.
It's like the last chapter.
Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. There was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. Then I heard a loud voice from the throne say, "Now the dwelling of God is with men, and He will live with them. They will be His people, and God Himself will be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning, nor crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." He who is seated on the throne said, "I am making everything new." And He said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true." He said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To him who is thirsty, I will give to drink without cost from the spring of the water of life. He who overcomes will inherit all this, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. The cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, those who practice magical arts, the idolaters, and all liars, their place will be in the fiery lake of burning sulfur. This is the second death."
All right. The first thing that John sees is what? A new heaven and new earth. Unfortunately, in English, there are two Greek words that are translated new, so we always have to kind of distinguish between them. The first is neos. How many of you guys watched The Matrix? The main character in that is Neo, right? All right, neos, new is kind of that word. All right. Neos is new in time. And so if we could probably think of it like a baby is new in time. First computers are neos, new in time. I am a neos compared to my father, and so on and so forth. Kainos is new in quality. A lot of times we talk about restoration, right? So my cell phone would be Kainos compared to a landline or even a rotary phone, right? So compared to each other, it's a better quality, even though it's not necessarily new in concept, if you will. Or I guess even my cell phones are Kainos to a computer now too, right? The first computers. So we always have to kind of decide. There's some overlapping. Sometimes they mean the same thing, but most times we do have that distinction here. This one here for new heavens and new earth, which one do you think it is? What's that? Neos? It's actually kainos, which is always interesting, okay? So here it's standing in contrast to the first heaven and first earth. A lot of times we have in this picture that that this will all be destroyed and we'll have something brand new, brand spanking new. And that's not necessarily what we see throughout Scripture. What we do see is a refining fire, like I think 2 Peter, 1 Peter. We also see that we get to inherit the earth, but if the earth is gone, what do we inherit, right? So it's a renewing, a restoring of creation. Paul in Romans 8 that we talked about this as creation's longing to be restored from futility. All right, and so that's kind of what we have here is this restoration. So it's standing in contrast to the first heaven and first earth. Then he says there's no longer any sea, and this one always trips us up because we have to kind of figure out what he's talking about. In Revelation, so we just focus on Revelation, we look at sea in Revelation. There's 5 basic meanings sometimes. So sometimes the sea in Revelation is the origin of cosmic evil. Sometimes it represents unbelieving or rebellious nations. Sometimes it's the place of the dead. We just read that last week when it said the sea gave up its dead. So sometimes it's the place where the dead reside. Sometimes it's a location of idolatrous trade. So the sea captains are trading their idolatrous wares. And sometimes it's a literal body of water used as an expression for the totality of creation. So sometimes we're talking about the sea and we're meaning all of creation. So we always are left, once we see multiple ways that the sea is used, with the question, which one does John mean? What's that? Probably some kind of combination of all 5. All 5 can work. So just depending on how it's done here. I think what John is trying to say in this is evil no longer exists. Okay? And so any of those ones that deal with evil can definitely be a part of this. In verse 4, he's going to have a phrase that's very similar. And so it's probably a combination of all of these. Essentially what he's saying, the old order is gone away with, right? The first heaven, first earth away, the sea is gone. The way things used to be is no longer the case. Something new has come, okay? And it's that restoration to a restored state to the way things were supposed to be is what's happened here. And so evil wasn't supposed to be, right? Evil wasn't here in the original creation that was very good, and now it's being restored to that. Almost like a reset button on the Nintendo, right? Let's reset this. Or I guess I don't know how to make that applicable if you didn't have a Nintendo. So, all right, verse 22. Verse 22 or verse 2. I don't know where I get that. This relies heavily upon Isaiah 52 and Isaiah 62 as well. So in Isaiah 52, Jerusalem is called to shake off its chains of oppression and to adorn itself with splendorous garments. The discussion in Isaiah is about Israel being in captivity and finding freedom from that captivity because of God's working in history. And I think we can say that throughout Revelation here, right? Throughout the book, we've seen the captivity of God's people by wicked institutions whose strengths have come from the dragon and its minions. Now that the dragon has been dealt with, freedom exists for God's people. True freedom, complete freedom exists. Isaiah 62, the vindication of Zion, which is Jerusalem, the mountain of God, right? Zion is the discussion, and in the passage is the idea of a marriage to God explicitly laid out. And so God rejoices over Zion like a bridegroom rejoices over his bride. And that kind of plays into verse 2 here as well. Interestingly, throughout Revelation, the word prepared, so we see this in prepared as a bride, that word prepared throughout Revelation carries with it the sense of an ability, so you're able to be prepared because of what God has done. So they have the ability to be a bride because of what God has been doing. It probably also reminds us of 19, 7 through 8, which speaks of the saints being dressed as a bridegroom. Or, a bride, not a bridegroom, bride. Sorry, said that wrong. And so what we have to kind of do is figure out what is the holy city, what is it kind of representing, and based off of everything we read in Revelation, it probably is figurative for God's people. Okay, so the holy city, Jerusalem, is God's people. Kind of like how Babylon is representative of wicked people in general, but a particular Rome or wicked institutions, but are run by people. It's the same thing. The holy city probably represents the church and the people that make up the church. Which then leads us to a voice from the throne. Okay, we do have to ask who. It's either God or one of the four living creatures. We're not quite sure. It doesn't really matter. The point is it's coming from the throne, and they are speaking. And what they are speaking of are the promises of God's dwelling with his people, right? God's dwelling place is now with his people. This does come from many Old Testament passages. In particular, Leviticus 26, 11 through 12 is one of the first ones that talks about a promise that God would be with his people in the tabernacle. In particular, the tabernacle represented God's presence on earth, and that he would be with his people in their midst. But there are other Old Testaments that talk about it as well. Now, there is one thing that's interesting. A very important Greek word, it's different in Hebrew, but a very important Greek word is the word laos. Let me make sure I do that right. Laos, yeah. I'm going to be right on this. We'll be good. Okay? Which is just a generic people, but anytime that... and this is in contrast to another word, which can also be translated as people. Okay? So, laos, ethnos. Okay? Ethnos is where we get our word ethnic from. So generally when you see that word, we say Gentiles, because that's how the Jews would have used the word. So anybody that's not us. And the word that they use for them is laos. Okay? And so this is a word that's specifically throughout both the Old Testament and New Testament speaking of God's chosen people. We are the laos of God. Okay, so we see this quite often, but it's always in the singular, except for here, in which it changes from people singular to people plural. Now, why would John make that change? Yes, yeah, it's essentially like you gotta kind of read because John doesn't really say that, but that's the point that he's making. It's not just a people; it's all peoples that are God's people from all nations, not just a select special. So it's always been God's plan to be with his people. I guess that's the next idea. So that's something to kind of read in between the lines there. Interestingly, this has always been God's plan to be with his people. While the temple and tabernacle served as temporary dwelling places for God amongst his people, that was all they were. They were temporary, showing this ultimate purpose that God wanted to dwell with his people for all of eternity. The last thing that he says in the promise is that the old order is gone, right? So he says he will wipe away all tears from their eyes. There'll be no more death, mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order has passed away. This probably comes from Isaiah 51 again. Isaiah 51:10, the prophet notes that God is the God who rescued Israel by moving the Red Sea out of the way. And this leads to the prophet to explain in verse 11 that God has caused sorrow and sighing to flee as well. So what did John just get done saying in verse 2 about the sea? It is no more. And then almost right away he's saying sighing and sorrow is fled from the presence of God. So he's probably really heavily relying on that Isaiah 50 passage, 51, 52, as he's writing some of these things. So he does mention several things here. Tears being gone, death being gone, sorrow, pain, crying. These are no more because the way things used to be is no longer the case. So I think that's, if we go back to verse 2, right? What is the sea? Why does he say it that way? It's because the way things used to be is no longer the case. It's been fixed, if you will. Redeemed is probably a good biblical word for that. All right. Then we get to verse 5. This is where we see God actually speaks. We know for sure he is speaking because it says, he who is seated on the throne speaks, right? And what does he say?
It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega.
What's the first thing he says? All right, I am making all things new. This probably again comes from Isaiah. Isaiah 43:19 says that the old way will pass and a new way will come. God, and this for John, this finds ultimate fulfillment in the consummation. Also, Isaiah 65 says that the prophet is commanded to write down God's words, which is what John is commanded to do at the end of verse 5, right? Write these down because they are trustworthy and true. I think this is like the third or fourth time that John's been commanded to write down these words. And so we don't need to talk about that too much. Then God continues to speak in verses 6 through 7. He says, then, it is finished. All right, who else said it is finished? Jesus. When did Jesus say it? On the cross, right? Same words. I can't say the word. Tetelion or whatever. Telios is and then it's the perfect version of that. And I think we can also say that up to this point, the whole point of the book has been judgment. And now that we get here, it is finished. The judgment is finished. Now let's talk about what's happening after. And I think that's what we can kind of take from this. He also says, I am the Alpha and Omega. This is not the first time. There are only 2 times in Revelation where we are left without a doubt that is God who is speaking, and this is one of those cases. In both cases that we know for sure that God is speaking, guess what he says? I'm the Alpha and the Omega. All the other times it says a voice from the throne or near the throne. Like, we don't know if it's God speaking or somebody else speaking for God, but the 2 times we know for sure that God is speaking, he says, I am the Alpha and the Omega. What does Alpha and Omega mean? Beginning and end. What is it? Okay, sorry. What is God trying to communicate by saying those words? Yeah, sovereign over history. What did you say? Yeah, he's always been. Yeah, he's eternal, right? And so God is beginning and end and all in between. Okay, so we're not just talking about the first and the last. We're talking about everything else as well. All right, and that he is in charge of history is kind of the point that he's trying to make through it. He is eternal and so has that. The 30 given water should be thirsty. There's an S missing. The thirsty are given water. This comes from Isaiah 49, who notes that those who thirst will be given water and will not be charged money for it. Okay, and so John kind of summarizes that here, right? He says they will be given waters without cost from the springs of life. We have this phrase, to the one who's victorious or the one who overcomes. We've seen this several times in Revelation. Where did we see it consistently? There's 2 chapters where it said it over and over again. Yeah, the letters to the churches, right? To the one who's victorious, to the one who's victorious. And now we get to the very end, to the one who is victorious. And so everything that John's written from chapter 4 to now has been encouragement to the churches of the letters, right? This is what you get to inherit. Okay, the one who is victorious inherits. Reflects the letters, and explain later. We'll talk about that in a little bit. All those promises that are given in the letters are in the next section kind of brought back up. Okay, so to the one who's victorious, their name will be in the book of life. Okay, we're going to talk about that. To the one who's victorious, will get to eat from the tree of life. We're going to talk about that. Okay, so all those things are going to appear, and it's kind of reminding us of that section. Then it says they will be his sons. We can say children collectively. This probably comes from. No, sorry. I wanted somebody to say Isaiah. It's not right. 2 Samuel 7:14. 2 Samuel 7:14. God gives a specific promise to David. That promise is fulfilled in Jesus. But if we are in Christ, we are a part of that promise, is kind of what John is trying to communicate here. So if you're in Christ, you have something else. Lastly, verse 8, we have a warning probably to Christians who dare to compromise, all right? And that includes being cowardly, unbelieving, vile, murderous, sexually immoral, practicing magic arts, idolatry, and liars, all right? They do not get to inherit. So to the one who's victorious and doesn't compromise, you will inherit a lot of good stuff. But if you do compromise, your place is outside, is kind of what John is saying here. Cowardly liars are common phrases in the New Testament for compromising Christians. The rest of the acts are in the list are associated with the dragon throughout the rest of Revelation. And so what he's saying is if you're going to be with the dragon, so really your choice is this. Are you in Christ or in the dragon? And you got two options. You can be in the city, in the new heavens, and new earth, or you can be outside in the lake. So those are your two options, and that's kind of what John is doing in these last two verses, kind of summarizing everything that he's been talking about since chapter 17, and really everything he's been talking about throughout all of Revelation, right? You get those two options. So participating or partaking in the way of the dragon results in condemnation. And it seems that it's not even a part of the new creation, right? They're outside of that in some way. All right, what do we learn?
If you compromise, you'll be in the lake of sulfur. Or the lake of fire.
Yep, don't compromise.
Great hope to look forward to if you
Overcome. That's kind of what I focus on. I said the victorious ones participate in the glorious new creation and spend eternity in the presence of God as his children. And I think that's a good focus, right? This is why we do what we do. This is why we endure persecution and endure trials and endure evil, is because there's something good and glorious in the presence of God for all of eternity.
Would you please elaborate on cowardly?
In the New Testament, it's just a word. So like it's those who compromise. So if I needed to elaborate, I'd say cowardly are those who are unwilling to stand firm in their faith. So they back down when pressure comes. And so they'd rather compromise so that they didn't get in trouble. I can give a historical example. In the early 300s, late 200s, there's a guy by the name of, I'm going to say Diocletian, but I don't feel like that's the right guy. There's an emperor that starts with a D. And I can't remember if he's Decian or Diocletian, but I will just say Diocletian for the sake of it. But don't quote me there. Anyway, he comes in charge of the empire. He decides that the reason why the empire is failing is because there's not enough worship of the emperor. And so what he decrees that must be done is that everyone must go and sacrifice for the emperor. And what they did is they gave you a little plaque saying you had done your job. And if you didn't have that plaque, you couldn't buy or sell. So does that sound a lot like Revelation? All right, then this is a couple hundred years after Revelation is written, okay? And so what do you do in that sense as a Christian? Because they also required all Christians in particular to give up their holy writings as a part of this. Most of the empire just ignored it, which is kind of weird that the emperor would issue something and then not do it. But in Africa and in Alexandria, in that region, they did. They were very much, yes, we're going to follow this. And so as Christians, you ended up having two groups. We end up calling the first group the Donatists. And what they said is, if you cannot do that at all. If you do that at all, you're compromising. And so they actually broke off from the church for a couple hundred years and then were brought back in. But you could not do that. But then there was a lot that did compromise. And then when Constantine took over for Diocletian and Christianity became a thing, what do you do with those people that compromise, right? So why did they compromise? Why were they willing? Some of them was like, you know what, they're crossing their fingers, right? Like, oh, he's not really a God, so I can do this so I can get my thing and I can sell and trade. But if you're sacrificing to the emperor, is that really idol worship? I mean, these are real questions and we don't feel it a lot in America, but they still feel it a lot in other places in this world. What do you do as Christians to survive? And that's really what John's writing to, is these people that are trying to figure out, how do I survive in this world that is very much anti-Christian, that's very much geared towards idolatry, to very much, if I want to be a part of the guilds, I need to go to the guild functions, which includes worship of idols. Can I do that? And if I don't, I'm going to get kicked out of the guild and can't practice my trade and have no money and can't supply for my family. So what do I do? And so John, this word cowardly in New Testament is always geared towards those Christians who are unwilling to say God comes first. And so they're always compromising. They say, I can go to this so that I can survive, without trusting that God will take care of you. Right? And so that's kind of what that word is expressing, if that makes sense.
Yes. I just wonder if it was like that, or if there was something else that was written into it, because cowardly doesn't seem to be that bad when you just think of the word, he's a coward. I think that's thrown around pretty freely.
Yeah.
But when you think about the fact that the Lord, what he gave,
Right.
we've got to stand, and yet, when is that time?
Right.
Lord, please give me the strength. If somebody comes to my door and knocks on my door and says, okay, I want this or I want that, and you know what probably their motive is? What are you going to do?
Yeah. It's a good question. And until we face it, we don't always know how we're going to do it or how we're going to respond. But yeah, like for John's readers, like it's a very important question. And so I think when he uses that, he's saying that whole section, everything in there is dealing with either the dragon stuff that I just erased, or with compromising in general, general words for compromise.
Well, it's one of the very first ones that's mentioned.
Yeah.
Murders is first, but there was quite a bit to me.
Yeah.
Difference between
The
severity of those.
Well, even the last one there is liars, right? All liars, which is always fun. That's the we always had a saying when I was growing up. Revelation 21:8. Liars go to hell. Liars go to hell. Burn, 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 burn. I mean, we had a little song that we did just to encourage people not to lie, right?
But I mean, like, if his church is cowards, I mean, what's the point of the church?
Right.
I mean, if you don't stand for anything, you'll fall for anything.
Yeah.
You know? And I mean, it's probably one of the most principles stances for a Christian is you have to stand for the gospel of Christ no matter what.
Yep.
Calling somebody a coward because they don't want to fight somebody, in a schoolyard or something is a lot different than what coward means in this
Exactly. So yeah, I mean, he's definitely focusing on the fact that they're not willing to stand up when pressed or persecuted or facing these outside pressures. Stand up for Jesus.
It's really the exact opposite of Christ.
Yeah.
I mean, there was no cowardness to Christ, and we're supposed to emulate him. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right, the next set of visions, we're going to do it a little bit differently than what we've been doing just because of how it works out. The next set of visions expands on all the statements found in the letters to the churches in chapters 2 through 3. Chapters 2 to 3 give us a picture of an imperfect church. If you guys remember those letters, we saw that over and over again, right? Like, this is what you're doing well. This is where you're failing. This is where you need to get better. A couple of them, there was like, there's nothing good about you. You're bad right now, and you need. So it's an imperfect church is the idea. And there's a bunch of promises. If you overcome, if you're victorious, you have these promises to look forward to. So that's chapters 2 to 3. Now here, from 21:9 to 22:6-ish, we get a picture of a perfect church. Or perfected church. How about that? That'd probably be a better word. And so we're going to see that throughout this. And so if you need to go back and reread the letters to kind of see how this plays back, we're not going to do it here. Additionally, a lot of this comes from Ezekiel 40 through 48. There's going to be a lot of similarities. So the last section was a lot of Isaiah. Now we're going to reflect on Ezekiel 40 through 48. And Ezekiel 40 through 48 is a consummation passage in Ezekiel. The glory of God comes back, fills the temple and the land. And what John kind of does is combine all of Ezekiel's into this one image of the holy city, Jerusalem. And so there's a lot of divisions on how to break this out. So we're actually not going to read the whole passage because that's a really long one. And then we'll just read it little by little based on different things that are being the focus of it. So we'll start with 9 through 14.
And one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls full of the 7 last plagues came and spoke with me, saying, "Come here, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb." And he carried me away in the Spirit to a great and high mountain, and showed me the holy city Jerusalem, coming down out of the heaven from God, having the glory of God. Her brilliance was like a very costly stone, as a stone of crystal clear jasper. It had a great and high wall with 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels. And names were written on them, which are those of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel. There were 3 gates on the east, 3 gates on the north, 3 gates on the south, and 3 gates on the west. And the wall of the city had 12 foundation stones, and on them were the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb.
Sorry, I was just going on to the next one. Okay. All right. Verse 9 is a transitional verse. It's very similar to 17:1. So in 17:1, we're told that John's there, and one of the angels that held the bowls came to him and said, "Come, let me show you the fate of," I forget what he exactly says, but it basically he says, let me show you the whore of Babylon, right? And so it's like, if you read what they say, it's almost word for word the exact same. So the second one's going to show us the bride of Christ. So it's a transitional verse, bridging to the next idea. And then what does he show him after he sees the bride of Christ? Jerusalem. Okay, and so that's where we're at here. The Jerusalem has to be Christians. Okay, just because for him to say all these things is this introduction and to see a city. Okay, so we got to keep that in mind as we're reading this. Well, let me not get too far ahead of myself. Ezekiel 40 through 48 is definitely in the back of John's mind throughout all of this. In Ezekiel, he has like 10 times where he says, I was carried away in the spirit. A lot of the times that he's told that, it is always for judgment of Israel, except for one time in chapter 43. And in that one time in 43, he sees the blessings that God is bringing to the city, and he does so from a high place, which is very similar to what John says, right? Like I was taken up in the spirit to a great and high mountain, right? And so very similar to Ezekiel 43:5. And so we're going to see Ezekiel 40 through 48 pop up over and over and over again. And so he sees the holy city. And again, I think what we have here is symbolic language for this event. The city symbolically is going to represent God's people because it's the bride of Christ, the wife of the Lamb, and it's the people that are a part of it. And so everything that we're going to have here is focusing on that symbolic nature. Now, here's the question. Is there a literal city? I have maybe, right? But it may not look exactly how John describes it here because there's just going to be some weird things. But if we take the symbolic nature of the items involved, it makes more sense. And so we should look at that symbolic nature and what's trying to be communicated with it. All right, so verse 11. So we're going to look at the blessings that people get to enjoy. And so verse 11 begins with the first blessing, and that is God is present with his people. We're going to see that over and over again throughout these next couple of chapters. And how do we know that God is present with his people from verse 11? Yeah, it shines with the glory of God, right? That happens only in the presence of God. Okay, so the city is shining with God's glory. Again, this probably comes from Ezekiel chapter 43, where the prophet saw the glory of God come upon the new temple and shine throughout the inhabited earth. In the past, the temple was necessary to separate the holiness of God from sinful humanity. However, we're going to see that there is no temple in the city because God's glory is just there, because there's no need to take away that because the sinfulness has been taken away in the new city. The city is also likened to a jewel. This is going to be expanded upon in just a little bit, so I'm not going to dive too deeply here. It's going to be discussed in greater detail in just a little bit. Then verses 12 through 14, he finishes his initial description of the city. He says there's a great and high wall. This probably points to the security of God's people. All right, so in the new heavens and new earth, there's nothing to worry about on the outside. All right, we are protected. He also says that there's 12 gates with 12 angels guarding them. Ezekiel 40 describes the temple very much in this same way with the same pattern, 3, 3, 3, 3. The question is, who are the angels? Where else have we seen 12 angels in Revelation? Oh, there's 24 elders.
12 tribes.
Was it during that, I don't know if I would call it a war, but it was basically 12 angels trying to fight against?
Oh, that's Michael. No, we don't know how many there were there. We have here a question mark. Maybe angels of the churches. There's 7 of those. Maybe is the idea here is God's people again in the number 12 instead of 7. We just have a question mark. We don't know. I got question marks, right? Anytime you see a question mark, it means I don't know. No one else does either. So, who knows? They could just be angels, yeah. It's going to be interesting, right? So, this is jumping a little bit ahead. I don't think we'll get to it today based on time, but just a preview, right? In the city is the tree of life. And then where else was the tree of life? Garden. When Adam and Eve were kicked out, what we specifically are told keeps them from coming back? Angels standing guard against people coming in. Now we have angels standing guard of open gates, not to keep people out, but to make sure those gates don't shut. And so it's kind of an interesting conclusion. And so that's just a little preview. We'll talk about more. The gates have names on them, and they're the names of the tribes, right? Okay. I don't have that written on there for some reason. There's also 12 foundations stones, and the foundational stones have the names of the apostles. So we have 12 tribes of Israel, 12 apostles, which equals 24, which is just, again, this idea of God, the completeness of God's people, both Old and New Testament people of God are in this city. Interestingly, it's the apostles that are the foundation stones, not the tribes, which gets us a little interesting, because normally we would say it the other way around, right? The Old Testament is foundational for the New, and so we probably would expect it to be the other way around. But it does fit the New Testament narrative that the church serves as the foundation for the new, complete Israel of God. The Lamb is the ultimate cornerstone, with his apostles serving as foundation stones for the church. And so that's probably what John's trying to do there. All right, I think we can read the next section, then we'll have to probably stop. And it's verses 15 through 17. Maybe we can get 2 more.
The angel who talked with me had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city, its gates and its walls. The city was laid out like a square, as long as it was wide. He measured the city with a rod and found it to be 1,200 stadia in length, and as wide and as high as it was long. The angel measured the wall using human measurement, and it was 144 cubits thick.
Okay. So again, this is where we probably have to recognize symbolic nature of the language involved. I'm glad that translations have not tried to. Anybody have something other than 12,000 stadia? There we go. We just need that. All right.
Mine says 1,400.
Sure. All right. 15 to 1,400 miles. Okay. This is when you do that. Sometimes it's okay.
Thousands.
Oh. Okay, sure. Sorry about that. The problem is when you, sometimes it's okay to do that, right? Like how much does this weigh? How much does this cost? Sometimes it's okay to do that, but in Revelation, it's not okay to do that because it misses the point of what's being communicated. All right. And so I'm glad that at least one translation here does that. So just to make sure. Interestingly, an angel measures the city temple in Ezekiel 43 through 5. And it also is a square, which is interesting. Oh, I guess I'm getting ahead of myself here. Why measure something? Understanding, maybe.
So you get a good picture in your mind about how huge the place is.
Okay, maybe.
How many people can fit in it.
Maybe. Probably you're measuring it to represent a decree to guarantee God's future presence. So here God's saying, measure it as proof that I'm going to do this, if that makes sense. And that's probably the concept here. The city is laid out in a cubic structure. Okay, so Ezekiel's is a square structure. So Ezekiel's is a square structure. John has a cube, which... What's that? I teach math to my kids, so every once in a while I have to do this. There is some question if maybe it's like a ziggurat, because the walls are not the same height as the structure. And so if you have a ziggurat, maybe you can do that differently. But I think trying to figure this out, or even picturing it as a cube, I think it misses the point, okay? It does say, again, 12,000 would be the completeness of God's people, 12 times 1,000, right? 12 being the complete people of God, 1,000 just emphasizing how much, right? The totality, the greatness of it all. And so that's probably what we should think of when we're thinking this. 12,000, interesting, 12,000 stadia is about the length of the known Hellenistic world. Now, I don't think John does that on purpose because I think he's focusing on something else. But a 12,000 cube would be the Roman Empire at its greatest extent, if you would. Maybe even a little bit
So
beyond
it's
that.
huge.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Half of the states, pretty much.
What's that?
Half the United States.
New
I
York
don't know how
to,
big
it
it
says
is.
New York to St. Louis is 1,400 miles.
Okay.
But flip the other way.
So a third.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Again, the walls are 144 cubits. Stadia is a great distance. Cubits is just this. Okay, so they are not anywhere close to being the same. So again, I think the point isn't that it's probably, I don't know if it's a ziggurat or not, right? I think you'll see in our picture it kind of shows it kind of like a ziggurat, but the reality is 144 is speaking again of the completeness of God's people in a different way, 12 times 12. All right, and so I think that's really what the focus should be.
I don't think anybody that day when they get there is going to get out their patient problem.
Because you said that, I'm going, no. All right, so here I kind of show you this, right? They're viewing it as a hill in this picture, so it's as tall as it's going to be long, and then your walls are a little bit different. So, all right, 18 to 21, I think we can get that. We'll have to stop after that.
The wall was made of jasper, and the city of pure gold, as pure as glass. Sorry. The foundations of the city walls were decorated with every kind of precious stone. The first foundation was jasper, the second sapphire, the third agate, the fourth emerald. Oh, you said they're 20.
Yeah.
Good instructions. Well, the fifth onyx, the sixth ruby, the seventh chrysolite, the eighth beryl, the ninth topaz, and the 10th turquoise, and the 11th jansen, and the 12th amethyst. The 12 gates were 12 pearls, each gate made of a single pearl. The great seat of the city was gold, as pure as transparent glass.
So again, at this picture, you can see the different layers of the foundation stone, maybe different colors representing those stones, and a giant pearl. So again, I don't know about you. I've never seen a pearl as large as a city gate. And so again, we got to think of this as figurative language. She's trying to say hi to you there. All right. So we have 12 precious stones making up the foundation. Interestingly, these are the same stones as Exodus 28, 17 through 20. 8 are identical as that Exodus passage. 4 are semantic equivalents. So sometimes we have a stone and I might have a name for it that you have a different name for it. Fool's gold is a good version of that, right? It's actually a different name, pyrite. All right, 2 different names for the same thing. That's what we mean by semantic equivalence, okay? What is Exodus 28 talking about? Yes, the high priest's breastplate, and each of the stones represented one of the tribes. It would have its name on it. And when did the high priest wear that breastplate? One time a year. When he went into the Holy of Holies, okay? And so we should have that in mind. It's representing God's people in the Holy of Holies, which the Holy of Holies, ironically, is a cube, right? So we should keep that in mind as we're reading all this. So what we have here is this idea that God's people enter freely into God's glory. And we don't need a mediator anymore. We don't need a high priest to go in front of us, right? We get to enter into that ourselves. And that's what John is trying to communicate with this idea. The streets are of gold, which speaks of the pureness of its residents. Okay. Interestingly, Babylon has the same adornment in chapter 17. She has precious jewels, including pearls and gold, and she is adorned in much the same way, which I think we can see a difference, right? We can be like Babylon, compromising with the dragon to be so adorned, but it is false wealth that will not last, whereas being faithful gives you the jewels at the end that last for eternity. And I think John's trying to communicate that concept to his people here. All right, the goal next time we meet will be to finish all of Revelation. So we have a little bit of chapter 21 and all of chapter 22 left. It might take 2 more weeks, but my hope is we can do it in one. So it might be a speed rush